Amusement and theme park rides are often divisive. What is beloved by one fan might be despised by another. There are endless debates on whether any given ride is good or bad, thrilling or uncomfortable, fun or boring. But every now and then, the stars align and a majority opinion emerges, and fans, critics, and casual guests alike all come together in their shared love or hatred of an attraction. And in Six Flags' case, there is no coaster in recent history that has been so widely rebuked as Magic Mountain's Green Lantern First Flight. On May 29, 1971, Magic Mountain opened its gates. The park, located in Valencia, a neighborhood of Santa Clarita, California, opened with 38 listed attractions. Of those, 3 were created by Intamin, a Swiss-based ride designer and manufacturer that had opened just a few years prior. Another designer and manufacturer, the California-based Aero Development, famous for its contributions to Disneyland, would provide 4 rides to Magic Mountain, including the park's signature coaster, Gold Rusher. This, combined with the Bradley & Kay Little Dipper Kiddie Coaster, meant that the park would only operate 2 coasters in its first year. But this would soon change. Over the next 3 decades, the park would gain an additional 15 coasters, lose 3 of them, for a grand total of 13 by 2000. This put Magic Mountain, which had since been bought by Six Flags and renamed to Six Flags Magic Mountain, in striking distance of Cedar Point. Amusement parks thrive on records. It is almost a requirement for parks to have at least one ride that can boast being the tallest, fastest, longest, or first of its type. But the record for the most coasters in a single park is an especially coveted title. Six Flags Magic Mountain announced in late 2000 their intention to add 2 additional coasters, bringing Magic Mountain's total to 15 and beating out Cedar Point by 1. One of the rides would be a record-breaking Vekoma boomerang named Deja Vu, and the other would be a coaster unlike anything on Earth. Aero, which had become Aerohus and then Aerodynamics, now had 3 coasters operating at Six Flags Magic Mountain, and they were partnering with the park to create a one-of-a-kind coaster. Using a design patented in the mid-90s by John F. Mayers, an attorney that apparently just patents coaster designs in his free time, Aero and Six Flags Magic Mountain set out to build the first ever 4th dimension roller coaster. A 4th dimension coaster is characterized by the addition of a horizontal axis, in which the cars can turn and spin guests perpendicular to the track. This can create additional inversions, or even keep guests upright as the vehicle inverts. Aero's coaster, designed by engineer Alan Schilke, used 4 rails rather than the standard 2. 2 rails would keep the train on the tracks, and the other 2 would use a rack and pinion gear to control the spin of the seats. So while the coaster would appear to spin freely, the rotation would be controlled and the same for every guest as the train made its way along the track. The coaster was an innovative concept from Aero, who had lost significant ground in the industry since their heyday decades prior. The coaster, titled simply X, or sometimes Extreme, was planned to open in the summer of 2000, but this would not be the case. Design issues and miscalculated construction costs would delay the build months, with previews taking place in December and the ride finally opening on January 12, 2002. The ride would put Six Flags Magic Mountain at 15 coasters, 1 more than Cedar Point, awarding Magic Mountain the coveted title. However, the ride's debut was not the celebration that it should have been for Aero or Magic Mountain. Aero lost millions on the coaster. The unique design was supposed to put them back on the map, but it instead forced them into bankruptcy. On top of this, Six Flags' frustration over the delays and mechanical issues led them to sue Aero, which was the final nail in the coffin for the company. Meanwhile, Magic Mountain was doing their best to keep the attraction operating through constant mechanical issues, which caused delays in opening every day and multiple downtimes. The dispatch rate of the unique design was slow as well, and wait times could be as long as 5 hours. The reception of the ride itself was generally positive, ignoring these inconveniences, but it was clear that the ride was not functioning correctly. In early June of 2002, after only 6 months of operation, Magic Mountain closed X for repairs. In the meantime, Cedar Point was able to win back the title of most coasters operating in a single park, with their addition of Wicked Twister. This would be brief, as X would be up and running again in August, resulting in a tie between the 2 parks. Aero and its assets would be sold to the Utah-based manufacturer S&S, which created S&S Aero to continue the company's legacy. However, S&S seemed to be only interested in the 4th dimension coaster, and using X's design, S&S Aero would build the world's second 4th dimension coaster, named Ejinika, at Fujiku Highland in Japan. This coaster had a few design differences that fixed many of the issues of X, which was still struggling at Magic Mountain. After years of issues, delays, downtimes, and even periods of closure for maintenance, Six Flags bit the bullet and revamped the ride. In December of 2007, X closed for renovations, opening back up on May 24, 2008 as X2 or X Squared. A new color scheme, new effects, new trains, and critically, a new loading system was implemented. X2 operated more efficiently and was better received by guests. Despite all of the issues with the initial Fourth Dimension coaster, the promise of the concept did not go unnoticed. Rival manufacturer Intamin began designing their own Fourth Dimension coaster in the mid-2000s, debuting their version, named the Intamin Zackspin, in 2007. Two Zackspins were created, Kirnu at Linnanmäki in Finland, and Inferno at Terra Mítica in Spain. Despite being Fourth Dimension coasters, giving riders the ability to flip on a horizontal axis, there were significant differences between Intamin and Arrow's design. First, the Zackspin's track is laid out vertically, resulting in a very small footprint and compact design. Second, while X2 had 7 cars to a train, with 2 guests on either side of a car, and all 28 guests facing the same direction, the Zackspin had a single vehicle, with 4 guests on either side, 2 facing one way and 2 facing the other. This resulted in difference number 3. The axis of the rotation was not centered to the riders, rather it was centered to the car. And finally, and most importantly, the Zackspin models were free spinning. While Arrow's designed predetermined rotations, Intamin's varied depending on weight distribution. The first 2 Zackspins were rather short in length. In 2009, a slightly larger Zackspin in Grönalund in Sweden, named Insane, would debut. 2 years after that, Intamin would create a 4th Zackspin, identical in layout to Insane. This would be the first Zackspin to debut in North America, and it will be located at none other than Six Flags Magic Mountain. On October 20th, 2010, Six Flags Magic Mountain announced the addition of 2 new coasters, a relocated kiddie coaster from Six Flags New Orleans, and a new Zackspin themed to the Green Lantern titled Green Lantern First Flight. Six Flags, which used to be owned by Time Warner until 1998, still had a close relationship with the Warner Brothers movie studio, holding the long-term licensing rights to many of their classic characters and DC Comics heroes. The new ride would take this synergy one step further, as the new Zackspin was set to debut at the same time of the Green Lantern film starring Ryan Reynolds, which was scheduled to open June 15, 2011. This was somewhat appropriate, as both would be received similarly. Green Lantern First Flight would be located in the westernmost section of the park, which at the time was named the Gotham City Backlot. It would be renamed to DC Universe to accommodate Green Lantern's addition. The ride would take over a small section of land that at the time held trees, lunch tables, and a Gotham City statue. Construction began in early 2011 and continued into the early summer. However, the ride would miss its opening date, being delayed 2 weeks past the movie's premiere. Testing began in June, and there were a few kinks to work out. In reality, this was probably just caused by someone not tightening the lid on the water test dummies. But never ignore an omen. The ride had the same specs as Insane. It was 107 feet tall and reached speeds of 35 miles an hour. It was celebrated as the first ever completely vertical pattern zigzag roller coaster featuring 360-degree spinning seats in North America. What took them so long? Most importantly, for marketing, it was a record-breaking coaster, technically. The coaster itself broke no records. As aforementioned, it was a clone of Insane. However, the existence of the coaster broke arguably the most important record, which is of course, the most coasters in a park. Green Lantern First Flight would be the park's 18th coaster, beating Cedar Point's 17.
Now with the most coasters on the planet, go big. Go Six Flags Magic Mountain.
This was just in time for Magic Mountain's 40th anniversary, and the park touted that they now had the most comprehensive collection of thrilling coasters anywhere in the world. A media event was held for the ride on June 30th, 2011. The grand opening ceremony was star-studded. Aquaman was there, Wonder Woman was there, and of course the Green Lantern himself was there, in brightest day, in blackest night, in spandex that hide nothing from sight. The following day, the ride was open to the public. Guests would approach the ride, viewing the coaster, a large Green Lantern power battery, and a large Green Lantern illustration. They would pass under a sign for Ferris Aircraft, where courage takes flight, the fictional aircraft company where Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern himself, was a test pilot. They would pass by a model of a plane and more information on Ferris Aircraft. As guests entered the Q building, they would be met with Abin Sur's wrecked starship. The next room would feature a Green Lantern power battery and a pre-show video of animated Green Lantern illustrations. Next, they would be greeted by a sign featuring the Green Lantern Oath. The line would then be split so that guests could board on both sides of the track. Guests would be seated 8 to a vehicle, 4 in each car, with 2 passengers facing forward and the other 2 facing back. The ride began and the spin was unlocked, giving riders their first preview of what was to come. They would lock in position as guests began their ascent, resulting in guests climbing the lift hill at a number of angles depending on weight distribution. Guests would then brave the 107-foot or 33-meter lift hill before beginning their zigzag descent along the 828-foot or 252-meter track. The most intense section was the final element, which whipped guests up and over a steep curve before locking the cars upright and returning guests to the boarding area. Guests would exit the ride on the backside of the Q building. The entire experience was about 60 seconds. Reviews of Green Lantern First Flight were generally positive out of the gate, and fans and critics praised the coaster as an intense and thrilling addition to Magic Mountain, compacting some of the unique experiences of X2 into a small footprint. Some critics were underwhelmed, calling it a glorified flat ride, but overall, reviews were good. The ride had a maximum capacity of around 800 people an hour, but Magic Mountain almost always ran the attraction with fewer than the maximum amount of vehicles, resulting in the capacity being closer to 500 an hour. Guest demand for the small coaster was not as overwhelming as the larger attractions, but it seemed that Green Lantern First Flight was a solid, thrilling addition to Magic Mountain. However, guests' opinions were about to do a 180. As it turns out, Zack spins are much more about the spin than the Zack. It was reported that the maximum amount of 360-degree rotations the free-spinning cars on Green Lantern First Flight could accomplish was 3, with the minimum being 0. But many reported in the early months accomplishing 4, 5, or even 6 spins. The amount of rotations depended on the weight distribution of the car, and reportedly, how much the cars were allowed to spin. The latter rumor purported that there was a friction mechanism that the park or ride operators could control, so while the cars would still be free spinning and capable of 360-degree rotations, the amount of force necessary to make a full rotation could be much greater depending on this setting. But this has not been confirmed. Weight distribution, on the other hand, definitely plays a huge role. Supposedly, ride operators in European parks where the other 3 Zackspin coasters resided make an effort to maximize the number of rotations by purposefully picking heavier riders and pairing them with lighter ones. Of course, Six Flags would not make the same effort, resulting in varying ride experiences. Fewer rotations leading to a less thrilling ride was not even the real problem. The biggest issue was the experience that fewer rotations could cause. Not only is going upside down fun, but on the Zackspin's intense zigzag descent, it is often necessary to avoid whiplash. Cars that are inverting with the curves of the track have the force of each sharp turn distributed more comfortably. But if the car remains upright the whole time, riders are violently pushed, pulled, raised, and dropped, banging around in their restraints, defeating the enjoyment and purpose of the ride. Plus, as previously mentioned, Zackspins placed guests off the horizontal axis in which they spin, exacerbating the whiplash effect, as each guest is essentially catching up with the movement of the ride. The restraints were also less than comfortable, with many guests complaining of pain in the shoulders and in some cases, hits below the belt. To put it delicately, it was a pelvic nightmare. This tainted the ride for many guests, but the complaints were minimal during the ride's opening months. It wasn't until early 2012 that the ride would develop its reputation among coaster fans and regular guests as one of, if not the worst Six Flags coaster in operation. Through late 2011 and early 2012, the ride experienced a few breakdowns, leaving riders either facing the sky or upside down for an extended period of time. This was either a prevalent issue or something Six Flags wanted to avoid entirely, as an adjustment was made to the ride's design to prevent this from happening. The vehicles, which prominently displayed fins that appeared in the formation of a throwing star, were given additional metal, filling in the gaps, resulting in a solid structure. Reportedly, this weighed the vehicles down and significantly reduced the amount of possible rotations. And after this change, riders reported a much worse and much more painful experience. Some called the ride neutered, fitting considering that others began reporting that this is what the ride did to them. This is not merely to engage in the immature humor of the classic low blow. The only ball busting going on here was that of the ride. The reports of crotch botches plagued the ride's reputation. The ride was advertised as an attraction capable of, quote, squeezing a lifetime of action into 90 seconds. But many riders claimed after the change that it only squeezed one's ability to make a life out of them in 90 seconds. The ride's bad reputation would only grow throughout the years, and a palpable hatred was brewed. In July of 2014, Green Lantern First Flight and all of the Intamin Zaxpins were closed out of caution after an 18-year-old man died after falling out of the Inferno Zaxpin in Spain. It was soon revealed that the park had modified the attraction's restraint without the knowledge of Intamin, and the other Zaxpins were reopened. The following year, a new fourth dimension free-spinning coaster would open at Six Flags Fiesta Texas named Batman the Ride, but this would not be developed by Intamin, rather SNS Aero, which had since been acquired by Sansei Technologies. The company had built one additional fourth-dimensional coaster in X2 style at China Dinosaurs Park, named Dinoconda, but this would be the last of its kind that SNS Sansei would develop. Batman the Ride was similar to a Zaxpin, but different in a few key ways that solved many of the problems that Intamin's design had. First, riders were separated into cars of 2 rather than 4, and the axis was centered on the seats, more specifically the riders' stomachs, resulting in a more comfortable experience and a somersaulting effect. Second, the cars use a magnet and fin mechanism that allowed for forced spins in key areas, while allowing free spinning during the rest of the ride. This concept, again designed by Alan Schilke, was a huge success, and a total of 9 SNS free spins had been installed throughout the world. To compete, Intamin announced a new generation of their free spin model that shared more than a few similarities to SNS's version, although so far, none have been installed. As fourth dimension coasters spread throughout the world, Green Lantern First Flight continued to disappoint. The amount of negative reviews for the attraction cannot be overstated. It was truly despised by many. While there was a minority of people that enjoyed the attraction and thought everyone else was not tough enough for it, many more Magic Mountain visitors actively avoided the ride. And then suddenly, in July of 2017, Magic Mountain closed the coaster, giving no explanation as to why. Rumors circulated that a woman had hurt her back on the ride and was suing the park, but nothing official ever surfaced. In early 2018, trim brakes were installed, leading many to believe that the ride was just being modified for reopening. However, this was not the case. The ride remained closed for the rest of the year. In early 2019, Magic Mountain guests noticed that the ride was being tested. However, this time the rumor was not that the ride would reopen. Rather, the coaster was being tested before it was to be sold or moved. This most likely was the case, as it was soon revealed that La Ronde, a Six Flags park in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, was to receive the ride, which would be renamed Vipère. Six Flags Magic Mountain's official reasoning for removing the coaster was to make way for new development. No progress has begun on the area, and the queue still remains intact. The coaster was dismantled in late 2019 and transported to La Ronde, where it was to open in 2020, but the COVID-19 outbreak has indefinitely delayed the ride's opening. Green Lantern First Flight's replacement was rumored to be an RMC Raptor single-rail coaster. Plans were filed with LA County, but the park's closure, also due to COVID-19, will postpone and potentially cancel these plans. Luckily, the removal of Green Lantern First Flight would not affect Six Flags Magic Mountain's title of the most coasters in a single park. More coasters had been added since Green Lantern First Flight's debut, and Magic Mountain now has a 2-coaster lead over Cedar Point, with Magic Mountain at 19 and Cedar Point at 17. Although many fans would argue quality over quantity. Green Lantern First Flight was about as universally hated as a coaster could get. It was not without its fans, but the majority of guests seemed to agree that it was not worth the whiplash. Most disappointingly, the ride was received well before the modifications. It is possible that the coaster could have lived on with a much different reputation if Six Flags had not made the change. It is not often that the removal of a ride of any kind is cheered, but if there's a silver lining to be had, unsuspecting guests will no longer be subjected to the pain and whiplash caused by Green Lantern, so long as they don't watch the movie.
My Dinoconda don't want no.
That's enough.